Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today in our election series, a look at where presidential candidates stand on gun violence prevention. I speak with Josh Horwitz and Crifasi, co-directors of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. Let's listen. Josh Horwitz and Crifasi, thank you so much for joining us again on Public Health on Call, this time for a very important conversation for our What's at Stake for Public Health with the Election series. Today, we're going to be talking about the prevention of gun violence, and we're going to start off with the fact that both of you were actually at the White House last night. So, Josh, do you want to tell us what was going on there?
Yeah, it was an exciting time. Thank you for having us at this exciting time. So we were able to, both of us, go to the White House. There was a number of executive actions announced. It was also the anniversary of the first-year anniversary of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. So it was somewhat of a celebration of that. And also, I think there was an opportunity for the administration to talk about what they want to do aspirationally. So if we start with the executive orders, there were two. One was based on looking at schools, live shooter drills, where I think there's an emphasis there not to traumatize and re-traumatize people, to create guidelines that would be effective at helping, an active shooter situation, but not traumatize the young people. The other piece was that there's a proliferation now of what's called switches, which makes semi-automatic handguns and rifles into fully automatic weapons. And law enforcement has seen a lot of those, and the administration created a task force to do something, to create policy, because these are really causing a lot of damage on the streets.
So a switch. Cass, could you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Sure. So these are 3D printed pieces of plastic that go into the firearm and allow them, as Josh said, to shoot automatically. In a handgun, for example, you might be able to fire 20 rounds in 2 seconds. And these are small pieces. Often law enforcement might not even know that they are in a firearm until they go to test fire it. And it's causing a lot of harm on the streets of our communities.
Thank you for that context. That's really important. Josh, you also mentioned it's a one-year celebration of the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. Tell us about the significance of that.
Well, the Biden-Harris administration created this office a year ago. It's the first Office of Gun Violence Prevention. It's staffed by very seasoned professionals and headed by Vice President Harris. And they've looked and helped create a number of different executive orders and also worked on the implementation of the Safer Communities Act, which, as the listeners may recall, was passed in 2022 and included a number of different provisions, but was a historic investment in crisis response orders, and also in creating community mental health clinics, and also doing a number of things directly related to firearms, like increased background checks for people 18 to 21, creating the first federal crime for trafficking in firearms. So that took a lot of work, and the administration has an office to make sure that's all being done, and they really want to highlight that, which is very exciting. And then I think that one of the purposes was also talk aspirationally, what it might look like in a new administration if Congress does change. What are the things that they'd be looking for? And the vice president talked about an assault weapons ban and talked about more robust background checks. So there was a number of things that they were doing. So there were really three things going on: the executive orders, celebrating the accomplishments of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, and talking aspirationally about what the future might look like, and what types of policies it might have, and how to make America generally safer from gun violence.
In this series, we've been talking about the direct and indirect implications of different administrations. And it sounds like what you're describing is a very clear signal from what could be a Harris administration that gun violence prevention is certainly on their agenda.
It's very much on their agenda. This is something that they're very much leaning into. And for someone who's been doing this for a while, the change of tone, the ability to talk about this up front rather than sort of hiding and talking around it is really remarkable. Just in the last just in this administration, I think two things are coming together. Not only is it good policy, it's turned into very good politics. And this administration, and I think Vice President Harris and the campaign trail especially, are with a remarkable degree of clarity talking about gun violence in its starkest terms and talking about solutions and and clearly they think it's a winning issue. So they're leaning into it. And so it's a remarkable change in politics, and it was very clearly on display yesterday.
And so the other candidate running for president is Donald Trump. We've already seen one administration under him. Could you talk about what a second term might look like in terms of preventing gun violence?
Well, I think there's a couple of different scenarios, but there's stark differences between what the different, potential administrations would do. The biggest thing under a Trump administration would be the rollback of research dollars. So the Biden administration historically made money available through CDC and the NIH for researchers like Professor Crifasi to be able to study some of the most important issues that we have today in gun violence. And it's made a big difference. That research has shown remarkable things about it. We know a lot more about gun violence, even in the last 4 years. And so when you think about a Trump administration, the President Congress, the President House of Representatives has already tried to roll it back. And under the next president, there's no doubt in my mind that research dollars would be cut off. And all the things that the agencies are doing, like the Department of Justice, would be cut off. I think the idea of some of the stuff that needs implementation in the Safer Communities Act, for instance, the crisis response programs in the Department of Justice, I've no doubt that they would be completely cut off and eliminated. So it's the resources there. They may try to roll back some of the laws that are passed. I think that's more difficult unless they get 60 votes in the Senate, which I don't think they will. Although, of course, there's new talk about rolling back the filibuster as well. So I don't want to fully speculate, but I do think what we're really, the big issues here are going to be the resources. And in a Harris administration, I think you would see robust funding for implementation of extreme risk protection orders, community mental health clinics, and much more resources to fund important and answer important questions in the firearm research space.
And Cass, I saw you raising your hand. Do you want to bring some context to this as well?
Yeah, I would also add, I agree with everything that Josh just laid out. I would also add that resources for the enforcement of gun laws, both at the federal and state level, is a big difference between these campaigns. Thinking about investment in the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, how frequently and how thoroughly we can inspect licensed gun dealers, holding people accountable when they bring guns across state lines, thinking about the tone around enforcing these laws and the expansion of so-called Second Amendment preservation actions that states and cities are taking to try to push back against federal laws. I think that enforcement piece is really important also, because we can have laws on the books. If we don't implement them well, if we don't enforce them, then they're just words on a page.
Josh?
Yeah, I mean, the president talked about this yesterday, about the potential ability of a Trump administration to gut the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the FBI's enforcement authority. So the administrations have stark differences.
So let's talk a little bit about, the research piece of this, the data and evidence that you all bring to all of these conversations about gun violence prevention and to very important policy impacts from that. So Cass, do you want to talk a little bit about what's on your mind around this?
Sure. When we're thinking about sort of the research that we are doing into the effectiveness of different policies, we're really trying to look at where is the evidence showing us we're going to get the best effects, but we're also thinking about what is the public support for these policies, because we don't want to have effective laws that are going to exacerbate existing racial disparities or health inequities or further marginalize populations. And so we're looking at some of these policies like firearm purchaser licensing, which Delaware recently passed, and Washington State is considering some legislation. We're thinking about extreme risk protection orders. Josh and Shannon Frederoli lead the National Extreme Risk Protection Order Training and Technical Assistance Center. And so thinking about those policies, not just from their effects at reducing gun violence, but also how are we effectively implementing them. Those are just two policies that we're really excited to see states considering. But we could also see some action, I think, federally, should Congress decide that they want to take up additional policy action creating some more universal requirements for background checks, including this licensing piece, better implementing and funding these crisis response tools like extreme risk protection orders. And we know that this is an important issue, right? Gun violence is the leading cause of death for children in the US, age 1 to 17, and it's more than doubled over the last decade. Like, there are solutions to the problem that is continuing to be an important public health issue.
I think it's also important to point out here two things. One of them is this myth that laws or policies or discussions around anything that might hint at curbing people's access to guns is very unpopular and no one wants to touch it. And the second one is there's a myth that federal dollars cannot fund research. And so, Cass, do you want to walk us through that first one?
Yeah, so we do a biannual public opinion poll because we want to look at, do people support these policies that we know are effective at reducing gun violence? And turns out people agree on a lot of things. And there's really broad support for these effective policies. Things like extreme risk protection orders, for example, are supported by 75% of US adults. And things like firearm purchaser licensing, more than 70% of adults. So we have much more common ground on these than.
And then let's talk about the second myth that's really circulating, and that is this, what's called the Dickey Amendment, this idea that, funding for research around this is not allowed. Josh, do you want to talk about that?
So starting in the late 90s, there was an amendment to the spending bills, which prevented money to be spent to promote or advocate for gun control. That's actually the language in the statute. And so for many years, people just would not fund money to get, the Congress and everybody was worried. And so they didn't appropriate money to fund this type of research. But really, if you look closely at the amendment, it's not about the research per se. Nonpartisan research looking at outcomes of gun policy is completely allowable under the Dickey Amendment. And so the Biden administration has recognized that and has made money available to both the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control to fund research looking at the efficacy of gun laws, of programs like community violence intervention programs. And so we're starting to see those results. And of course, there's results that show different things, but we're seeing strong results in areas that our center cares deeply about, like firearm purchaser licensing and extreme risk protection orders.
There's another myth here that, maybe gun violence prevention laws and policies don't work, but you're coming up with evidence to the contrary, Josh.
We definitely are, and Cass is leading a lot of that, so I'll toss it over to her for that discussion.
Sure, thanks, Josh. There are lots of common misconceptions around gun violence, and gun laws not working is one of the most pervasive that we have to deal with. But our research, the research of many of our colleagues, shows time and again that gun laws do work. We see lower rates of gun violence in states with firearm purchaser licensing, for example. But it even goes up a step on the sort of path, which is gun laws that are strong and effectively implemented keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. We see fewer guns available for use in crime when states have strong background check laws, for example, with firearm purchaser licensing. So much so that the guns that are recovered in crime in a place like Maryland, more often than not, don't come from Maryland. They come from other states because our gun laws are robust. They constrict local sources for guns to be used in crime. So we have to go outside of the state to bring them in. And that's true across the board, across the country. States with strong gun laws aren't having guns used in crime from their own state. They're coming in from out of state, which states with strong gun laws are at the mercy of states with weaker laws. So we really do need a regional or a federal approach in some cases. But there are things that work that states can do to make it harder for people who shouldn't have guns to get them.
In terms of states, there is actually one ballot item that we know of that is directly related to gun violence prevention, and that's happening in Colorado. So, Josh, do you want to talk a little bit about that and what we know so far?
Yeah, that's a ballot initiative referendum. I'm not quite sure what they call it in Colorado, but to raise the excise, the tax 6.5% on firearm sales. and with the idea that that tax would go to prevention programs. It's modeled on something that's happened in California that is in place, and taxation is a policy that has a lot of promise. We haven't fully evaluated it yet, but there will be experience now because we're seeing in California. If Colorado were to pass it, it would create a great environment for us to study that, see how these things work. But the idea is let's create resources to pay for the harms that firearms create.
So this is a really important moment. Cass, as you mentioned, gun deaths are the leading cause of death for children. It is a huge problem in the U.S. It is something that is on everyone's minds. We have one administration that, Josh, as you mentioned, is very clearly and directly talking about this, doing things to help prevent gun violence. And then we have another administration where it's a little bit murkier, but it's not headed in that direction. And so at this moment, I'd like to ask for your final thoughts. Let's start with you, Cass.
For me, as a public health researcher who has spent more than a decade very specifically evaluating the effects of policies and programs to reduce gun violence, and as a proud gun owner, it's very clear to me that the Harris administration, future potential Harris administration, would really be applying a public health approach to this problem, effectively funding research and implementation, evaluating that research and determining how best to move forward to reduce gun violence. And for me, I think as we approach 2025 and what we need to be doing for the safety and security of our children, it's important that we have an administration that is going to focus on balancing rights and responsibilities of gun ownership.
And Josh?
And I'll just add, as our center, we don't take part in federal elections or state elections, but we certainly can tell you what the outcomes might look like. And in the Harris administration, I think you'd see a continuation of what's gone on in the Biden administration with very robust implementation of federal firearms laws and attempts to create new opportunities, new laws, new programs to reduce gun violence. I think if you have, this has been very clear of what the nominee Donald Trump has been saying, which is that they want to roll back some of these laws, but the real place will be in the effect that the federal government can have on reducing gun violence, both from the funding aspects and in the reduction of sort of crime prevention through the FBI and ATF and reducing those workforces. So I think you have there'll be stark impacts between these administrations. And so that's where we are right now. When you look at this gun violence policy, you have two very different approaches.
Well, thank you both so much. We really appreciate this context and nuance that you're bringing to such an important conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production management by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send us an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.